from day one. Let's get that match and figure everything else around that. Because otherwise, as we know, we're going to have some inertia put in place, and we say, "I'll do it later. I'll do it next year." You probably won't. So, day one, do whatever you can to get that match would be what I recommend.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, a higher education in personal finance. This podcast is for PhDs and PhDs to be who want to explore the hidden curriculum of finances to learn the best practices for money management, career advancement, and advocacy for yourself and others. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Roberts, a financial educator specializing in early career PhDs and founder of Personal Finance for PhDs. This is Season 19, Episode 1, and today my guest is Dr. Scott Grissom, a full professor of computer science at Grand Valley State University and certified financial planner with Socrates Financial Planning. Scott and I talk through the health insurance and retirement benefits options that may be available to PhDs in their first post-PhD jobs. Scott explains the tax benefits of investing via an HSA and/or a 401k or 403b, and the factors that affect the choice of a Roth or traditional option. He will also help you overcome potential analysis paralysis by detailing the benefits of a target date retirement account. My colleague, Dr. Toyin Ali, recently launched a new community called Grad Boss. Toyin is an expert teacher of grad school productivity and time management through the Academic Society, in addition to being a lecturer at an R1 university, so she knows of which she speaks. I'm honored that Toyin has invited me to facilitate a workshop within the community this month. Join the Grad Boss community to attend my workshop, Your Financial Orientation to Graduate School, on Tuesday, August 27th, 2024 at 4 p.m. Pacific, as well as access all the other incredible resources. Go to theacademicsociety.com/gradboss to learn more and join the community. I hope to see you tomorrow at the workshop. You can find the show notes for this episode at pfforphds.com/S19E1. Without further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Scott Grissom of Socrates Financial Planning. I am delighted to have joining me on the podcast today, Dr. Scott Grissom, who is at a really interesting point in his career where he has two jobs right now. He's a full professor at Grand Valley State University and also a CFP with Socrates Financial Planning, his financial planning firm. So we're going to talk all things investing today, which is really exciting. So Scott, thank you so much for volunteering to come on the podcast. And would you please introduce yourself a little bit further?
Sure. Excited to be here. So Scott Grissom, a little academic background for the PhD folks, if that's okay. So for my whole life, I wanted to be an architect. So I went to college at Texas A&M University, all set to be an architect and be the next Frank Lloyd Wright. And by the junior year or so, I had discovered two things. One is that I didn't like architecture as much as I thought I did. And two is I discovered these new things at the time called computers. So I got enamored with computers. And one of the professors that I admired a lot, I had taken several courses from him. I still remember where I was standing at the time. He says, "Scott, have you ever considered graduate school? I've seen the way that you work with your fellow students and you tutor them and you help them. I think you'd be really good as a professor." Well, I had not considered that at all until that moment, but the light switch went off, changed my career path, went to graduate school for computer science, with the sole purpose of getting a job as a professor. And 32 years later, I'm still a professor. So it's been a great choice. Highly recommend being a professor for the rest of your life if that's an option for you.
And yet you've decided to embark on an encore career. And so can you tell us how personal finance, how money became a passion for you alongside of your career as a professor in computer science?
Yeah, so as long as I can remember, I've been interested in my own personal finances, whether it be investing and reading books when I was in college myself. I used to get this thing called a magazine in the mail each month, this physical piece of paper magazine called Kiplinger's. And I would read I would be so excited every month waiting to see what information they would have about saving and investing and all sorts of stuff. And one week there was this article about this designation called the Certified Financial Planner, CFP. Ooh, that would be fun. At least for my own self education, I would like to take those 2 years of courses and see where that leads. So that was around 2005. And after taking classes for 2 years and then passing a pretty exhaustive exam, I earned the CFP designation mainly as a hobby. Didn't really know where that would go. But then I started helping friends and family with their financial questions, and then started to work occasionally with some small financial planning firms. And that passion sort of peaked and valleyed through my 25-year career as a professor. And now I'm to the point where I'm ready to move on. I've enjoyed being a professor, but for the next X years of my life, I'm ready to transition to probably just part time, helping, educating others, much like you do, in terms of their finances. And especially as they get close to retirement, what changes do they need to make? What adjustments, what questions do they have? So I've got another year as a professor, and then I'll be transitioning to this firm that I just created about 6 months ago called Socrates Financial Planning. Socrates building on the way that I like to teach in the classroom using the Socratic method. So I thought that was a fun, playful name for me.
Yes, very eye-catching as well. I love it. So we have a real treat today, which is to employ your teaching skills in the subject of investing. And even though you just said that, your typical financial planning client would be closer to retirement, when we were prepping for this episode, we talked about how the typical listener for this podcast is going to be very early on in their career, maybe currently in graduate school, currently a postdoc, maybe in their first job, post PhD. And so we were thinking it would be really great for them to have some insight into how to set up those initial investments with their new employer when they finally get that 401k or the 403b or similar type of retirement account access. So Let's go into it. So for that newly hired employee looking at the benefits package for the first time, it can be overwhelming. What are they probably looking at in terms of potential benefits related to their finances?
Yeah, so probably the biggest benefit most people have to struggle with initially is the health insurance. Now that applies to us because if they have an option for what's called a high deductible plan, which mostly they do nowadays, that will have an important financial option available for you called a health savings account. So maybe we'll come back to that in a moment. And then the second one is what kind of retirement account do you have? And in the private workplace, that's generally called a 401k. In the public space, whether it's hospitals or in my case, a university, they're called 403bs. Pretty interchangeable. And then just personally, you might have a thing called an IRA. So all three of these retirement accounts are virtually the same. They're a place for you to invest for the future. And there are generally some tax advantages to each of those, depending on what choices you're trying to make.
Okay, let's dive into that a little bit more. Let's start with the health insurance component of it. Who is a good candidate for choosing a high deductible health plan versus like a PPO is probably going to be their other option, I would imagine. And for also using that HSA if it can come with that HDHP.
Yeah. So hard to describe over this broadcast on what makes the best choice. Just recognize with a high deductible plan, depending on whether you're single or a part of a family, you're agreeing to pay the first $2,000 of your medical care, maybe the first $4,000. That's called the deductible. So you need to have an emergency fund, I guess, or enough fees. Also depends on your health. So if you're somebody that's pretty healthy and don't anticipate seeing the doctor much, therefore you don't need to worry about paying that deductible, that might be a good rationale, justification for getting the high deductible plan. And then it also just depends on locally, and if you're moving to a new city, you may not know, but picking what doctor networks that you have sometimes make a difference. So there I would say talk with your human resources department or a colleague that you're about to work with or a supervisor to see what choices they've made and why.
Yeah, so the trade-off there, for those who don't know, is going to be a premium difference. So the monthly premium that you pay for like a PPO plan, for example, is going to be higher, or at least let's say the overall portion. We don't know how much the employer is paying versus the employee in general, but that overall premium is going to be higher for like a PPO. It's going to be lower for that high deductible health plan. But like you said, you have to be prepared to pay out of pocket for a higher deductible, $2,000, $4,000 versus maybe the PPO is $500 or $1,000 or something lower than that. And so you have to have some savings available to do that in your own finances should you need to access medical care. And that's kind of where the idea of the HSA comes in. It sort of nudges you in the direction of, oh, you have that high deductible health plan? Well, you better be saving in this HSA. But tell us more about how the HSA works.
Yeah, so it's a very unique savings plan in terms of what the federal government allows for you. So it allows you to save money going into the account, tax-free going in, but it's also tax-free coming out, which is highly unusual. So that doesn't apply to the 401ks and the IRAs or even the Roths. So I really like the HSAs, the potential advantage that you have to save on your taxes from day one in your career. And so what that means is for every dollar that you put into this account, and it's earmarked to be used for medical, so for healthcare, to be spent this year or next year or 10 years from now. But all of that money is tax deductible off of your current income. And as we know, every dollar that you can shave off of your current income is going to reduce your taxes. So that's great for now, which is the way a lot of the retirement accounts work. But then later on, when you start to pull money out to pay for those qualified medical expenses, it's not taxed there either. And that's what's different about the HSA. So HSA saves you now, it saves you later. It's just a win-win-win when it comes to taxes, at least. And as you said, there is this sort of incentive to put that money into this account because you know you're going to have to spend it at some point this year, next year, 5 years from now on those deductible expenses. And so that's why the federal government requires you to tie together. You first have to have this high deductible plan. And then that allows you, it's optional, but I would strongly encourage it, to create this health savings account.
I've not had the reasonable option of signing up for a high deductible health plan with an HSA ever. So I'm sort of excited about this in a theoretical way. But my understanding is that if this comes through your employer, you actually save not only on income tax going in, but also your FICA taxes, your payroll taxes, which is like, there's like almost no other way you can reduce your payroll taxes. So that's like really exciting as well, in terms of more money in your pocket, more money in that account.
Yep, once again, and you're saving now and never taxed again on it, assuming you pull it out for medical expenses. And it rolls over each year. So there's another kind of a medical account called a flexible savings or flexible spending account that you might have options for. They're probably a little antiquated now, but the potential concern with them used to be you had to spend it or lose it at the end of the year. So back in December, then people started getting dental care and eye care and so forth to try to spend that money. But the HSA, you can literally let it run for 30 years. And so that's why some financial advisors think of this as sort of a third retirement plan, because we're always going to have healthcare expenses. And so the longer you can invest it and let that build tax-free, the more money in your pocket.
Yeah, I want to kind of underline that point that you just made about the potential for the money inside the health savings account being invested for the long term, because that's not something that I think people really did maybe 10 years ago with those flexible spending accounts. That wasn't an option. This is unique to the HSA. And so elaborate on that a little bit more, the power of that option.
Yeah, and it's something that I suspect a lot of people don't take advantage of. So generally by default, you're going to put this into an HSA and it's going to be treated like a savings account or a checking account and probably not pay you much at all, if even 1%. And for money that you're going to spend 3 months from now, that makes perfect sense. You wouldn't want to invest it because with investing, and let's just generally talk about investing in stocks, there's the concern that that money is going to go down in the short term. So, but if you're investing for the longer term, 4, 5, 8 years down the road, you're convinced that you don't really need that money out of the HSA, that you can pay for these medical expenses out of pocket, then the longer horizon that you have, the more options it gives you. And then you can now invest in stocks and mutual funds in your HSA, just like you would in these other accounts, such as the 403B and 401k.
Yeah, it's really like, I think you mentioned this earlier, like a supercharged form of an IRA. like an even better form of an IRA. But you have to be prepared to pay for those medical expenses and save into the HSA on top of that. So it's really a personal finance and budgeting kind of challenge, but a very, very powerful tool if you can harness it.
Right. So at the very least, you would want to contribute enough for your deductible each year. So even if you don't want to invest in the future and you're a little leery of building a large account of 15, 20, $30,000 in this HSA, if nothing else, remember that very first dollar that you save is saving you permanently on taxes. So if you've got a deductible of $2,000 and you're pretty predictable that you're probably going to spend about $2,000 this year on healthcare, then at least put that much into your HSA. And if it hovers above and around close to zero because you're putting money in and taking money out, you're still getting a great tax advantage from that.
Yeah, I love it. Well, let's talk about those more traditional retirement savings vehicles, the 401k, the 403b. Can you tell us generally, like, what's the advantage of investing for your retirement through your employer? And then we'll talk a little more about traditional versus Roth.
Okay. So as I said, 401ks are just the names generally for private companies, and 403bs for public companies / universities and healthcare. Historically, they've been what we call pre-tax. So I put money in and I get to remove that from my salary this year, which is going to save on taxes this particular year. So let's suppose I'm in the 20% tax bracket and I put in $1,000. Well, that's going to save me $200 this year on taxes. But eventually, I'm going to take that money out, presumably during retirement, and then it will be taxed then. So that's one of the advantages, is the tax advantage, is that we're going to have a tax advantage this year. It's going to build tax deferred, and then eventually we pay our taxes. But one of the new features that these companies now are allowed to provide, somewhat new, is a Roth component to this 401k. And now we have the option of, do we pay taxes now and put that into what's called a Roth account or a 401k Roth, but it's never taxed again, much like the HSA. So you can let that ride for the next 30 years and hopefully make lots and lots of money off of your investments, and then they come out tax-free. So that's one of the choices you're going to have to make, is if I have a Roth option for my 401k, do I put my money in there now, or do I use the more traditional approach? The second key, I think, question is your employer providing a match or not? And they often do, and it's often tied to how much you put in. So they might say, we're going to match the first 2%. If you put in 2%, we'll put in 2%. Or we'll put in 50% of how much ever you put in of the first 6,000. So either way, whether they're going to put 2,000 in on your behalf or 3,000 or 8,000, you really want to take advantage of that, because that's, in the business, we call that free money. And then you're going to invest that going forward. You're not paying taxes on it now. The employer is putting the money in, so it's not coming out of your paycheck. So if your employer does provide a match, be aware of, put as much money as you can in that affects that match.
I've also noticed sometimes with these employer provided plans that have a match, or maybe not even a match, but a baseline amount that they'll put in for you. Sometimes universities do that sort of thing. They'll have like a vesting schedule. Can you explain how people should understand the vesting schedule?
Yeah, so normally what that means, and it's a case of, as you said, it's the employer putting money in on your behalf, less so of the money that you put in. And they're going to, as a way to try to keep you employed there as long as possible, say, we're going to put $10,000 in each year for you, but you can't pull all that money out if you were to leave employment. So over the next 4, 5, 6 years, on a sort of degrading feature, we're going to decide how much of that money do you get. So you'll have employers say, this year I'm vested. Well, that means that this year, if I were to leave or get fired or whatnot, then I would at least get all the money that's in my account. Up until that point, it might look like I've got $50,000, but 20,000 of that might not leave with me if I choose to leave. As you said, it's generally what the money that the employer puts in. Any money that you put in is generally what we would say 100% vested immediately.
Okay, and so I'm thinking about a person who is just starting out and they're looking at this benefits package and they see that they have a match available to them. So exciting. But but maybe their personal finances are not totally in great shape yet. When should they pass up that free money and work on other areas of their finances? Is there ever a situation where you would advise that?
I wouldn't think so. I mean, so let's suppose you've got to put in 4% of your brand new paycheck that you're excited to get, and that's going to entitle you to matching. And you're leery to say, but could I use that 4% for something else, paying off student loans or paying off credit card debt? Well, that might be an appropriate use of it, but I would be more inclined from the psychological perspective is let's just commit to that 4% and then learn how to carve out additional savings from our new paycheck to pay for that other debt. I mean, debt would be the only reason I could see why you wouldn't want to get that initial match. And even then, I would really encourage you to, from day one, let's get that match and figure everything else around that. Because otherwise, as we know, we're going to have some inertia put in place and we say, I'll do it later. I'll do it next year. You probably won't. So day one, do whatever you can to get that match would be what I recommend.
Yeah, I really like that advice. A great point about the inertia. Like, when are you really going to make that change if you don't make it right from day one? And if you are really excited about getting that match and you're really hating, let's say, the credit card debt that you're in, maybe because of your move to your new job or whatever the case is, just use all those, well, they're probably negative feelings, but use them to energize you to get that debt paid off while you're still contributing to that retirement account and getting the match. And hey, then once the debt is paid off, you can increase that retirement contribution rate above the match level, let's say.
After celebrating and going out to dinner or something that you paid off your debt.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, still thinking about that new post-PhD employee. Let's say they have a Roth option and a traditional option within their retirement accounts. What are the factors that go into making that decision, which way to go?
So it generally comes down to taxes. And so as we said, that traditional contributions to 401k are tax deducted this year. So you save on taxes this year, let's suppose 20%. Whereas the Roth contribution, you don't save on taxes this year, but it goes in and you never pay taxes again. So the question becomes, do I want to save on taxes this year, maybe saving 20%, depending on where my income is, or when I start to retire and I pull money out, do I want to pay taxes then? Do I have any insight 30 years from now that I'm going to be paying less or more tax rates than I am now? And we don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know that for sure. But the general understanding is that the lower your tax rate is now, probably a pretty good chances 30 years from now, when you start pulling money out, your tax rate's going to be higher. So that puts you in favor of using a Roth now. It's less helpful to you to save 15% on taxes now, which is the Roth scenario, rather than to wait 30 years from now and pay 20, 25% coming out, which is the 401k option or the traditional 401k option. So I would say, what's the general recommendation? When you're starting off, it's generally the best time to do a Roth because you're generally making less income than you will in the future. And it also gives you a much longer runway, the next 30, 40 years, to invest that money and have it accrue tax-free, which is a really great option.
Emily here for a brief interlude. Would you like to learn directly from me on a personal finance topic such as taxes, budgeting, investing, and goal setting, each tailored specifically for graduate students and postdocs? I offer workshops on these topics and more in a variety of formats, and I'm now booking for the 2024-2025 academic year. If you would like to bring my content to your institution, would you please recommend me as a speaker or facilitator to your university, graduate school, graduate student association, or postdoc office? My seminars are usually slated as professional development or personal wellness. Ask the potential host to go to pfforphds.com/financial-education or simply email me at emily@pfforphds.com to start the process. I really appreciate these recommendations, which are the best way for me to start a conversation with a potential host. The paid work I do with universities and institutes enables me to keep producing this podcast and all my other free resources. Thank you in advance if you decide to issue a recommendation. Now back to our interview. Let's project forward a few years, maybe 10 years. So this person is no longer a fresh new PhD graduate in their first job, but they have increased their income somewhat over time. Is there a tipping point that you would say, or is it just for every individual? Where do you see your income potential going?
Yeah, that's a much trickier, but let's play that scenario. So some of my colleagues will say, if collectively, because we're talking about, I've been saying federal tax rates, but it also applies to state income tax if that's indeed it applies to your state. So in my state of Michigan, I pay about 4%. And if I'm in the 24% tax rate for a federal, plus the four is 28% combined, that's where I'm wondering, am I going to pay more or less than that when I retire 20 years from now or 30 years from now? And so I hear people talk about this magic, not magic number, but just sort of rule of thumb, about 30%. Anything less than 30% taxes now, it's probably a pretty good bet that when you're pulling money out later, you're going to end up paying more than that. So somewhere in that range, 25 to 30% is sort of this borderline category. Anything more than 30%, so if you're a very high income earner right now, you probably want to take advantage of saving taxes now because you might be in the 34% tax bracket or even higher, and you'll likely be taxed less than that 30 years from now, but we don't know for sure. So all these choices, it just sort of depends. You make the best decision you can at the time, and then don't look back. Don't worry, you made your decision, it's over, and what happens, happens.
Yeah, definitely don't use the uncertainty around where will my tax rate be in retirement as a reason to not get started, right? Like just jump in with whatever option you think is best at the moment. That's okay. Keep going with that. And my philosophy around it is kind of to want to get to retirement with a mix of Roth and traditional so that I can do some tax optimization on the back end. So as long as I have big pools of money in both of those types of accounts, by that point, I'll be pretty happy. I'll add in one other anecdote, sort of about how I made this decision earlier on in my career when I could see where my tax rates were going. So I, post PhD, was living in the state of Washington, which has no state income tax, but I knew that I aspired to move to California, which could be a high state income tax rate. And so I used that view into my own personal aspirations in my future to say, okay, when I'm living in Washington, that's a great time to use the Roth. And when I move to California, that's a great time to switch to traditional, assuming no other changes in my, overall income.
Very good. Good idea. Now, let's talk about that bucket that you mentioned. So when people retire, it's nice to have options. And so there's sometimes considered three buckets of Roth, which has already been taxed, 401ks, which have not yet been taxed. And then there's a third category that we haven't talked about. We call that a taxable account. And that's just where you're doing extra savings. So aside from these retirement accounts. And if you have sizable amounts in all three of these buckets, they're probably not going to be equal, and nor should you necessarily aspire to that. But if you've got some money in each of those, as you start to pull money out during retirement, as you said, that gives you some flexibility to control your tax rates. So you can start pulling some money out of a Roth because it's not going to be taxed at all, some money out of your 401k because it is going to be taxed, and then have some money in your taxable. So how do you manage that? How do you end up with three buckets? Well, we've talked about early on, maybe you start with a Roth for retirement, and then throughout your career, maybe you start to transition it. There's going to be perhaps some tipping point, maybe not. Maybe you just want to do Roth all in, and that's perfectly fine as well. But in that mid category, that 15 years that we were talking about, you could get to the point where you put half in Roth and half in a 401k. So there is no right or wrong, or it's not a binary decision, and that would allow you to continue to build in all three of those buckets.
Perfect. Let's talk about another decision that has to be made when you're contributing to that 401k or 403b, which is, what should I actually be invested in? Because the 401k or the 403b is not synonymous with the investments that could be inside of it. There's going to be some choice about what exactly you want to be invested in. So help that, fresh PhD with that first job, help them think through that choice of what exactly should they be invested in.
Well, still, first and foremost, when we come to talk about investing, the golden rule is called diversification. So we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. So although it would be really tempting to buy as much Apple stock as you possibly could, or as much NVIDIA stock as you possibly could, because that's currently what's hot, you run the risk of losing a lot as well. So how do we do diversification? Is we mainly, or most of us buy things called mutual funds, which are collections, hundreds, if not thousands, of individual stocks for different companies. So that provides you that diversification, and that's what you will generally be given as an option. So for your 401k, normally you're given a limited collection of choices for yourself. Those are often going to be what we call mutual funds. And so you still have to make choices. So maybe it's a choice out of 10 or it's a choice out of 50. That can be pretty overwhelming. So my approach is to pick mutual funds that buy a little bit of everything. So these are called index funds. And I know, Emily, you're a fan of passive investing as well. And so look for titles of these mutual funds that perhaps include index in the name. Probably don't call it passive, but they might say index. One of the keys when you're picking out mutual funds is the expenses that they cost. So most people don't realize, but you invest money in a mutual fund, and each and every year, the management company takes a little bit out of that. Maybe it's 1%, which would be super high, or maybe it's 0.1%, which would be pretty low. Sounds like the same thing to most of us, 0.1% and 1%. What's the difference? Well, it turns out 30 years from now, those build on themselves a lot. So when we're given a choice of mutual funds, back to the original question, is I want to look for something that is an index / called passive investing. And those generally have lower fees, which might be 0.1% or even less, which is more money in your pocket. Less money in their pocket, more money in your pocket, and that's the win-win. So first choice, pick mutual funds that are indexes. And then you might have to choose between, do you want to buy stocks or do you want to buy fixed income, which is often called bonds? That's probably a whole nother podcast, but the quick answer is most of us now have an option called a target date fund. And a target date fund is perfect for somebody just getting started because they don't need to worry about the ins and outs of picking what percentage of stocks and what percentage of bonds. Someone else is doing that for you, generally at a low cost. So if you have an option for a target date fund, they're going to have names associated with the year that you plan to retire. Now, there's nothing magical about it, nothing significant about it, but if you're just getting into your career now and you've got at least another 30 years to work, 35 years to work, so adding that to 2025, so 2060 would be the name of a target fund that you might look for. Vanguard has these, Fidelity, Schwab has all of these. And all that tells you is somebody has decided what percentage of stocks and bonds. So I just looked up Vanguard's 2060 target date fund, and 90% is in stocks and 10% is in bonds. The longer that you have to invest, the more volatility or the more ups and downs you might be able to mentally stomach. So if you recognize, yeah, the stock market went down this year, it's going to go down. I can guarantee you that. I don't know if it's this year, I don't know if it's next year, but at some point the stock market's going to go down again. And if you're okay with that, if you're mentally prepared to say, I knew that was going to happen, I'm going to keep letting it ride, then because you have the luxury of going for the next 30 years, then it's okay to have 90% in stocks. But as you get closer, and this is what those target date funds do for you, is they start to reduce the stocks and increase the fixed income so that as you get closer to closer, it might be a 60-40 split. So long-winded answer, sorry, my professor is coming out on me. But what are your choices as a new employee? If you've got a target date fund, generally pick that.
So sometimes I get questions when I teach about investing where the questioner says, I want to start investing and I want to use something safe. If one of your clients said that to you, I'm nervous about the stock market, I want to pick something safe, how would you coach them?
So safe generally means lower return. So whether you're buying bonds or treasury bonds, so safe means less likely to lose money, which is something that none of us want to do, but also less likely that you're going to make much money. So over the next 10, 15, 30 years, the question is, can you afford to be conservative? Maybe you can, but I think there's a bigger risk, a long-term risk, that if you're too conservative, you put all your money, the extreme would be you put all your money in a savings account, making 0.1%. And that's going to make you feel very safe, But 20 years from now, you're going to regret that because your money has not even kept up with inflation. So if inflation's rising at 3% every year. So it's really a mental game. I understand that the concern about potentially losing money, but hopefully you overcome that and recognize that over the next 15, 20, 30 years, you're likely not going to lose money and you're going to stay ahead of the game by investing in more what we would call more aggressive, not completely aggressive, but more aggressive investments, as you pointed out.
So something that I learned in our prep for this interview is in your financial planning practice, how your fee structure works, which I really appreciated. But I want you to explain it and explain why you think it's advantageous both for you and for your clients.
Okay, well, let's back up and recognize that there are hundreds of thousands of people that call themselves financial advisors in the US. That's not a regulated term. And so almost anybody can call themselves a financial advisor. And they generally make money from three ways. Now, we all need to make money, so there's no harm in that. One of them is that they make commissions. So they sell you products, whether they be what are called annuities or insurance or stock plans, and they make a commission off of that, whether that be 2% or 3% or 10%. Perfectly fine, assuming that they disclose that to you and they're recognizing, I'm going to make 10% off of you buying this $100,000 investment, but I think it's best for you, and that very well may be best for you. Then there's a category called fee-only advisors. So they want to avoid commissions with the potential of there being a conflict, or at least the perception that there might be a conflict. And they're generally going to charge you for ongoing what we call asset management. And so the going rate is generally 1%. Now, these are people that already have established accounts, maybe $1 million. And so they're going to pay their fee-only advisor 1% of that each and every year to manage their money and give them good advice and keep them on the straight and narrow. And then there's a relatively new category that we call flat fee planning, where we're not interested in managing the money for that client, but we want to just give them some objective, solid education advice. And then the person can go back on their own for the next 2, 3, 5 years, and then maybe come back for a refresher and say, how am I doing? What advice do you have me now? So I'm in that category. It's called flat fee. So for a particular fee, I offer a financial plan to clients that says, if they're starting out and or getting close to retirement, and says, let's take a look at all your finances, not just your investments, but let's take a look at your insurance and your estate planning documents and a variety of other aspects. Let's take a look at your goals and just do an assessment, an objective assessment to see if you're on track or not. So flat fee advising or flat fee expenses is the way I model my business. Useful for people, especially just getting into investing because they don't have a lot of money yet. And so the fee-only advisors that charge 1% probably aren't going to see you anyways. So that would be an advantage.
Yeah, especially if you may have zero in assets under management to offer if you only have your 401k plan, for example, if you don't even have an IRA that an advisor could even work with. So I really appreciate that flat fee model. It's actually, when I sought out financial advising a few years ago, that's the model that I went with for the advisor that I chose. So I'm a believer in it. Now it's a little harder to stomach maybe upfront because you have to come up with hundreds or a couple $1,000s, maybe depending on the advisor and the type of package that you're getting. Versus going to someone who makes money off commissions, well, it seems like it's free, but it's really not free. And so just to recognize, as you said, that everybody in this industry is getting paid in some way or another. As long as you're upfront about it, fine, then the client can choose how they want to pay for the service that they're getting. And there are advantages and disadvantages to each of those models, but I really appreciate the model that you've chosen. So that's great. And if someone listening really likes your style, likes how you've taught us through this episode, wants to work with you, or maybe wants to recommend you to someone else, how would they get in contact with you?
And so the name of the company is Socrates Financial Planning. So Socrates, because that's the way I always taught in the classroom using the Socratic method. So Socrates Financial Planning, SocratesFP.com is the website address. And from there, you can get an email or schedule a call with me or find more information about me. But SocratesFP.com is the place to go.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. And I want to conclude by asking you the question that I ask of all of my guests, which is, what is your best financial advice for an early career PhD? And that could be something that we've touched on already in the interview, or it could be something completely new.
Yeah, I would come back to that notion of day one, start contributing to whatever plan you have, whether it's the Roth or the traditional plan, certainly to achieve that employer match that we talked about. 10% might sound like a lot to start saving right away, but I would recommend you strive for that, if not higher. Set that up from day one so that you just learn to get by on 90% of your salary. And that's going to do such wonders for you 30 years from now. You will be so glad looking back that that was the best decision you ever made.
Well, thank you so much, Scott, for volunteering to come on the podcast. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Listeners, thank you for joining me for this episode. I have a gift for you. You know that final question I ask of all my guests regarding their best financial advice? I have collected short summaries of all the answers ever given on the podcast into a document that is updated with each new episode release. You can gain access to it by registering for my mailing list at pfforphds.com/advice. Would you like to access transcripts or videos of each episode? I link the show notes for each episode from pfforphds.com/podcast. See you in the next episode, and remember, you don't have to have a PhD to succeed with personal finance, but it helps. Nothing you hear on this podcast should be taken as financial, tax, or legal advice for any individual. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing by Dr. Lourdes Bobbio and show notes creation by Dr. Jill Hoffman.